Hello, you're watching part 4 of building a web app using ASP.NET Core 1.0, Aurelia, TypeScript, and Webpack in Visual Studio Code. I'm Raja Mani. I live in San Jose. I'm very passionate about technologies. I blog in opensource.netter.blogspot.com. This video tutorial is complementing the blog post series in my blog. I tweet and my Twitter handle is @RajaJhansi. Please check this Twitter handle for the updates on the new blog posts and YouTube videos. Prerequisites for this part is that you should have watched part 1, 2, and 3. The links can be found at the description of this YouTube video. You need some source code, which is available in GitHub. Both my tutorial source code as well as the Aurelia skeleton navigation source code links are also provided in the description of this video. What is in this part? We're going to be talking about Aurelia, a modern forward-thinking framework. We will talk about Aurelia TypeScript Webpack skeleton navigation project and how to use that as a base project for our application. Adding the skeleton navigation code into our source code. Running the integrated skeleton navigation application without using the ASP.NET Core's Kestrel web server. Easy Webpack, what is it and how does it increase our productivity? Creating our first Aurelia component. A component is nothing more than a combination of view and view model. We'll see that in detail. Bootstrapping Aurelia. Just like how you bootstrap any other framework, we need some bootstrap code for Aurelia as well. How to wire the greetings API controller that we already wrote in the previous parts. Aurelia's HTTP client and fetch client that you can use to invoke the REST API calls. Enabling cores in our API controllers. Invoking the greeting controllers get method from Aurelia. Let's dive right into the demo now. The first thing we want to do, as always, is to start from the previous part's source code. But before we do that, for this particular part, we need the Aurelia TypeScript Webpack skeleton navigation. Let's just see briefly about what is Aurelia, and then we'll go from there. Like I said, Aurelia is a modern, forward-thinking, convention-based JavaScript framework. It leverages web standards, and it is developed by a company named Durandal Inc., founded by Rob Eisenberg. Rob Eisenberg is known for his Eisenberg Effect blog, and he tweets at Eisenberg Effect. He's the brain behind Aurelia. And Durandal Inc. Develops Aurelia. It also as open source, as well as there are some supports available as a subscription. So you can buy the subscription if you want professional support as well. I'm very impressed with the development of Aurelia from the day it started and how quickly it is now in RC state. It's soon going to release, I think by end of July or beginning of August, this will go RTM. So with that said, let us see what is Aurelia skeleton navigation project. As you can see, to make it easy for people who want to develop applications in Aurelia, Aurelia team has put together a skeleton navigation web application. And you can see that there are about 6 different types of projects. There is a project on ES Next, which is ECMAScript Next ASP.NET Core, ES Next Webpack, ES Next TypeScript ASP.NET Core, TypeScript Webpack, and TypeScript. None of this will help us because we are going to be doing ASP.NET Core, TypeScript, and Webpack. So the closest one that matches our requirement is this skeleton TypeScript Webpack. So let's first start with that, and then we'll see how we can take the source code and how we can integrate that with our part 3 source code to create part 4. So instead of getting the source code into our part 4 folder, what I would like to do is I'd like to create a folder called staging, and then I'll clone the source code from GitHub for Aurelia skeleton navigation, and then I'll walk you through the steps on how you could take that source code and bring it into our application. So let me open up Commander and let me create the folders. Part 4 modern is our folder, and I will change into that and have it ready. And I will clone the source code of Aurelia skeleton navigation application in my staging folder. So let me hit enter, and it's going to fetch the source code. And as soon as it's done, we will follow the steps on how we can take that source code and integrate into our part 4. So I'm going to minimize this and let me get into the skeleton navigation project. Like I said, we are interested in this TypeScript Webpack project. So I'll open that. I'll open up my part 4 modern folder here. I'm going to copy the whole content from TypeScript Webpack into our modern folder using right click drag, and I'll say copy here. The next step is we want to bring our existing server-side code that we wrote in the parts 2 and 3. So let me go back into our tutorial folder. Let's go to part 3, and then we'll open up our folder. And in here, I do not want to get every folders. So I'm going to only pick and choose selected folders: controllers, properties, views, root, Docker file. We are not going to use Docker. Maybe towards the end of the series, I might I might prepare a video just for Docker deployment. We don't need package.json because the package.json that comes with the tutorial or skeleton navigation has more dependencies. So we don't want to accidentally overwrite that with our dependencies. Program.cs, project.json, readme is fine because we need to override our readme on top of the readme that comes with skeleton navigation. Startup is fine. We don't need tsconfig. We need webconfig. Okay, I'll do the same thing. Right click, drag and drop, and paste it here. We are okay with overwriting the readme command file, MD file. Then we need to open .vs code, and we need launch.json and tasks.json like we did in our previous lessons. I'll just copy that over here. Okay, then now I think we got everything merged. If you really want to check in this completed part 4 source code into GitHub, you might want to copy this git ignore and then merge the few items in this git ignore into that. I've given the detailed steps in my blog post, so I'm not going to repeat that here. Let's see how we can run this integrated skeleton navigation source code. You might be wondering why I didn't copy the greeter.ts, which I'll be doing in a few minutes. Once I'll get the integrated project up and running, then I can show you how we can bring our greeter class and how we can turn that into an Aurelia component. So let's start running the application. In order for us to run the application, like you always do, you need to run the npm install so it can go through this package.json and bring all the dependencies required for Aurelia. So let me run npm install. It is going to take a while to download this. So instead of sitting there and watching that download, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video for some time until it downloads all the dependencies. Okay, it has downloaded all the dependencies mentioned in package.json. Now it's time for us to run the Aurelia tutorial, which is the skeleton navigation application. So to do that, you will type npm start, and it's going to start the Webpack development server on port 9000. And you'll see that, yep, so it is running on port 9000 on localhost. So let us hit that URL, localhost 9000, and when you hit enter, it'll load the Aurelia skeleton navigation, and this is the skeleton navigation application. It has a few routes defined: welcome, GitHub users, and child router. We're not going to look into this in detail because we're going to now start looking at how I can bring in my greeter.ts class and then how I can integrate that with the navigation application. Okay, so now let me switch into Commander. Let me open up another tab because I don't want to stop this dev web server. So let's go into tutorial part 4 modern. Okay, so now let's copy the greeter.ts from tutorial part 3 modern into tutorial part 4. Okay, let's open this up. Let's go inside the app folder, copy the greeter.ts, and paste it into the source folder. Okay, so before we start talking about how we can turn this greeter class into a Aurelia component, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of Easy Webpack and what is that and why is it very good and why is it required. Easy Webpack is a project created by Aurelia core team member Basili Broshka. It's a project to simplify and modularize Webpack configuration. If you watched the part 3 of the tutorial, you might have seen how difficult it is to create a simple webpack.config.js. You need to remember the source folders, destination folders, and you need to configure a lot of loaders. And you also need to make sure that you take care of the minification, bundling. The Webpack is a great build tool or module bundler tool, but the documentation and the samples can definitely improve a lot. I've seen a lot of people complaining about that in the GitHub page of Webpack. I think it's an open source project, and instead of complaining, I think people should step up and then contribute and make things better. And that's what exactly Basili Barashka has done. That's why I want to give a shout out to Basili for doing an awesome job on Easy Webpack. It makes life easier for people who want to use Webpack and build Aurelia application using Webpack. As you can see, he has created lots of modular projects. Like for example, if you want to configure TypeScript, you just need config TypeScript, and you can configure less Sass. And every single aspect of Webpack is separated out as a module, so you are given a chance to either use them as it is, that is what we call as default configuration, or you can extend it or augment it, or you can completely override it. So most of the times the default configuration provided by his implementation is more than enough. But if you are someone who is really good in Webpack and you're an advanced Webpack user, you could make changes into the configuration. Let's quickly open up Visual Studio Code so we can inspect what is inside the Webpack config.js. So let me go to the third tab and then open up Visual Studio Code. Let's zoom in a little bit. Okay, so first thing first, we'll inspect Webpack config.js. As you can see, it uses the common JS require pattern, and it loads the Easy Webpack core, which is the base of the Easy Webpack, where it defines lots of global variables and then support variables. The thing that is really interesting to us is the bundles. We have some Aurelia specific Bootstrap bundles, and Bluebird is a promise library because Microsoft Edge browser's implementation of Promise API is really buggy and very slow. So Bluebird is a very good polyfill that can be used to overcome that difficulty. And here's the list of all Aurelia packages, as we call our Aurelia modules that we need. You might be wondering, will I need all of these modules? Maybe, maybe not, but it's always good to bundle them together because Webpack is efficient about bundling them, and then in production you can also minify that. So this way you don't have to remember, oh, did I install Aurelia history? Did I install Aurelia polyfills? Did I install Aurelia router, and so on. So it gives one central location where you have all the dependencies listed out. And then you have the base configuration. Like I said in the earlier part, you could have multiple entry points, and as you can see, there are 3 entry points. There's an app entry point, there's an Aurelia Bootstrap entry point, and there's an Aurelia entry point. And every entry point is going to end up in its own bundle, something like app bundle, Aurelia Bootstrap bundle, Aurelia bundle, and so on. And where should it write the bundles is where what you define in the output path property. And there are some configurations for production, testing, and also development. Since we are in development phase, we'll focus on this development part of the Webpack config.js. And as you can see, it is very modular. It brings in the configuration for a development environment, then it configures Aurelia and passes some parameters as to what is the root directory, what is my source directory, what's the title of my application, what is the base URL. Base URL is always going to be a slash, a forward slash, which indicates the root of the web application. Similarly, it has the TypeScript configuration, HTML configuration, CSS, fonts, Bluebird, and so on. So if you were to sit and write all these Webpack config.js entries, it'll take a lot of time. It is error prone. That's one of the beauties of Easy Webpack. So thanks once again, Basili. So we're going to get the benefit out of your Easy Webpack. And Aurelia skeleton application already uses Easy Webpack. Okay, with that said, let us jump into creating our first Aurelia component. How do I turn my greeter.js into a component? Like I said, Aurelia framework doesn't have too many decorations. So the greeter class that we already developed is already a view model. So you don't need to do anything fancy to turn this class into a view model because we already declared the class and we exported it. It's available for consumption from other modules, from other source files as well. So, well, now I have a view model, but how do I leverage the view model? What do I do with the view model? Like I said, a component consists of two parts, view model and a view. So you might have guessed by now, you need a view, and the name of the view is going to be the same name as the view model, but with an extension .html. Okay, what do I put in this HTML? Should I create a complete HTML or a fragment of HTML that will be injected into the DOM? You will do the latter because you already have index.html that kind of provides the layout of your application. So you don't want to start all over again with the HTML tag, body tag, and so on. You are going to only define what needs to be rendered from your view model into the browser. With that said, we're going to introduce some new terminologies or some new tags that are designed for web components. A web component is nothing but a snippet of HTML that is inert DOM subtree that defines inert DOM subtrees, which means that the browser will not act on that DOM at all. I'm not going to type the whole thing. Instead, I'm going to use the emmet, which is a shortcut. You can type the name of the tag. Then for the subtags, our children, you can use a greater than sign. So I'm going to have a div defined, and then I'm going to have another h1 tag defined. But I want to define another h2 tag that is at the same level, or an input tag that is at the same level as h1. For that, you'll be using the plus sign, and then you can say input. And for the attributes, you can always say type equals text, and that's good enough for now. Let's tab out by hitting the tab key, and it'll expand them into HTML tags. So this is called emmet, and it's a very popular shortcut. Most popular editors and IDEs support emmet. So the first thing we want to do is let's go back to greeter.ts and look at what properties we have. We have a nice accessor called greeting message. How do I display the value of this greeting message inside my h1 tag? It's very simple. You use the string interpolation, dollar curly brace, and then you give the name of the property. Instead of typing and making mistakes, I'm going to copy this and paste it over here and close the curly brace. We will, for now, not worry about this input tag. We will fill that later. Okay, now I defined my view and the view model. Is that enough? Not really. You need to let Aurelia know that it has to load this view and view model. For that, we need to talk about what is bootstrapping and how to bootstrap Aurelia. As you know, in many applications like in C++ and so on, there is a main method, and the application starts from there, and inside of that you do some bootstrapping code. Similarly, in web applications, we'll always use index.html is where we will start the application, and from there we will look for an entry point. Usually that will be either called as an app.js or a main.js. But it's a convention. You can name it anything you want, but as convention, people always prefer to use main.js or app.js. In Aurelia bootstrapping, there are two kinds of bootstrapping. One is the declarative bootstrapping. The other one is the manual bootstrapping. In the declarative bootstrapping, all that you need to do is you pick a HTML tag where you want Aurelia to inject the view model and views, whatever the computed markup after it evaluates the view model and the view. So you will do that by using Aurelia App Attribute. And it doesn't have to be filled with a value. You can just say Aurelia app to indicate that body tag is the place where Aurelia should inject the markup. This is declarative way. The other way is you could use programmatically. You can use programmatic APIs to inject the same attribute into any tag you want. We're going to follow the latter. We're going to use the programmatic way. And as you can see, in our previous parts, we used Webpack and it generated bundle.js, and then we gave that in your script tag, script source equals bundle.js. Here, we want to really leverage the power of the Webpack's Dev Server. It has this cool feature called refresh, auto refresh, and it also has a cool feature called hot module replacement. Whenever you make some changes, it'll detect the change and it'll automatically replace that module on the fly, and then it'll also do an automatic refresh. In order for you to do that, you would want to specify the Webpack Dev Server.js as inside your script tag. So that takes care of looking at the Webpack config.js and then go to the main entry point, and from the entry point finds the dependencies and loads all of those. And whenever you make some changes, it also is smart about changes, and because it's watching the file system, and when there's change, it automatically refreshes it. Unfortunately, the Microsoft IIS Express or Kestrel web server or even the full-blown IIS, they don't support this hot refresh and hot module replacement yet. Once they come up with that, once they have the feature integrated, then we may not need this dev server. We might as well use the Kestrel or the IIS Express or IIS. But for now, we'll use this Webpack dev server. And now we'll jump into the bootstrapping code, which is defined in our main.ts file. Okay, so the first 3 lines should be familiar to you because those are import statements to import a required class from a module. So we need the Aurelia class from Aurelia framework, and we need the Bootstrap class from Aurelia Bootstrapper Webpack. If you are somebody who has already seen Aurelia, and if you use system.js, then you might be wondering, why do I need a special bootstrapper? Aurelia team has written a bootstrapper which is specially designed for Webpack, and that's why we are importing that bootstrapper explicitly. And then we also need to import the base bootstrap interface as well. Then we have an entry point method called bootstrap that takes Aurelia instance as an argument, and this is where we will start configuring Aurelia. So we want to use the standard configuration, which means that it'll use the default binding language, default resources, and so on. In later modules, we'll see how we can configure and customize every one of the Aurelia component. Like I said, Aurelia is also modular. They don't believe in shipping everything as a single module to you. Rather, they want you to pick and choose what modules you are interested in using. If you don't need a particular module, you are not required to use it and load it into memory and make your application, not use it. It's not a good idea to include modules that you don't use. So that's the beauty of Aurelia. You can pick and choose what features of Aurelia do you want, and you can just include them. This development logging is all about sending console.log messages back into the browser so you can see how Aurelia is bootstrapping and Aurelia is starting. Then, like I said a few minutes ago, instead of using declarative syntax, we are going to be using programmatic syntax. So here what we are doing is we are looking at the DOM, we get the body tag, and then we set the attribute on that body tag with this Aurelia App Attribute to indicate that is the starting point where Aurelia should inject the resultant DOM. Then you start the Aurelia framework by calling aurelia.start, and Aurelia requires a root component, or it's called root element or root component, and you specify that by calling aurelia.setRoot, and you pass the name of the view model that needs to act, or the name of the component that needs to act as the root component. In here, since we wanted our greeter to be the root component, I'm going to change this to greeter. Okay, so what does it mean? Is that Aurelia goes through all these configuration steps, and it starts, and then it sets our greeter component as the entry point. But if you notice, our greeter component has a constructor and it requires some value. So if you run it now, because this time we are not explicitly instantiating greeter class, and Aurelia is calling, and Aurelia doesn't know what parameter value to pass to the argument, you're going to get hello undefined from TypeScript. Let us do that now and go back to the browser. And you can already see that it's already reloaded because of the automatic refresh and the hot module replacement feature of Dev Server from Webpack. So as I told you, this is undefined because we didn't explicitly pass any value for the message property. It's very easy in TypeScript to define a default value if no value is being passed. So I could type hello world, and before I save, I want to show you how this hot refresh or instant refresh works. So I'm going to just bring it over here, and then let us watch it. As soon as I hit the Control S, which is the keystroke for saving, you'll see that it changes from hello undefined from TypeScript into hello world from TypeScript. There you go. So we have just wired our greeter class as a component, and we have indicated Aurelia that this is our root element. Is that enough? Yeah, it's a good starting point, but that is not enough. The next thing that I want to show you is how we could take advantage of our API, the web API that we wrote in our previous tutorials. As you know, all these modern applications, they have a fancy term called SPA, single page applications. Usually they are built using the cool front-end technologies like Aurelia, Angular, JS, React, or whatnot. But the backend is always a RESTful API, that can be written using .NET or Ruby or PHP or any Node.js or anything. As long as that is a HTTP endpoint, RESTful endpoint that can serve JSON, Aurelia and all the other modern JavaScript frameworks will be happy to consume them. They'll be able to invoke them and then get the JSON back and then turn the JSON into good looking HTML and then inject that resultant HTML DOM tree into the browser. So when you are in the front end, your user experience is really good. You don't see the browser constantly spinning to make a full page refresh or post back as they call. Instead of that, it just renders the chunks of the HTML in different parts of the browser, and then you'll see if you watch in the network tab, quite a few AJAX calls have been going back into the backend RESTful APIs. So we have already developed one simple web API called ReadingsController. Let's go there and now take a look at it. Let me maximize it so we can see that in full screen. If you see that it has one simple endpoint called a get endpoint, and then it returns a string. Returning a string doesn't help when you want to consume it as JSON. So what we need is we need to define some model. So I'm going to call this greeting message, and then I will define a property, a string property called message. And instead of returning the string, I'll return the greeting message object. And I will just construct that object. And I will use the initializer syntax. And now we've turned this API to return a serialized JSON from a C# class called greeting message, which we usually call as models. It's just a terminology that's used. So now this can be consumed from our Aurelia greeter class. How do I consume an API endpoint? What type of features are available in Aurelia for that? That's where you have the HTTP clients. There are two types of clients that Aurelia provides, and one is called the Aurelia HTTP client, which is the basic client. That's just a wrapper on top of the XML HTTP request object. And there's another client called HTTP fetch client, which implements the fetch API. If you're interested to know more about the fetch API, go to the Mozilla Developer Network, and they have the specifications up here. And the Aurelia fetch client implements this API. This is the modern, implementation, and people are trying to move away from the XML HTTP request object, which has been there for a while. So both HTTP client and fetch client, they support the HTTP verbs like get, post, delete, put, patch, etc. Besides, they also give you some nice ways of configuration methods where you can configure some parameters for all the requests or per request, and also you could have some feature called interceptors, which allow you to intercept the request and response. So without further ado, we'll see how I could bring the Aurelia fetch client, because I prefer the fetch client, which is the modern standard, and I would show you how to bring the Aurelia fetch client, and then we'll see how we can invoke our greetings API controller's get method. So let's talk about the a concept called CORS, cross origin resource sharing. Why do we need that, and why am I talking about it now? If you remember, the greetings controller and this ASP.NET Core Web API is running inside of Kestrel Web Server, and the Kestrel Web Server by default runs on port 5000, whereas our front-end application, which is being delivered by the Webpack Dev Server, is running on port 9000. So you cannot make calls from one URL to another URL, even though the URL is the same, but the ports are different. The the web application, the HTTP standard wouldn't allow you. That's called a cross origin request, unless you explicitly allow the localhost 9000 as a valid, and as a valid origin inside of your web API. It is going to simply reject that. It requires some headers, and it's a security and safety mechanism to make sure that not everybody from any domain can call your API. So in order for us to enable CORS, we need to do a few changes into our startup.cs. We need to first bring in the Microsoft ASP.NET, Microsoft ASP.NET CORS library or assembly inside our project.json. Let's go to the project.json and then add that library. So I'm just going to copy this and just change the last part to ASP.NET.CORS. Okay. And then what we need to do is we need to add the CORS service in startup.cs, where we say services.add MVC. Right above that, you'll say services.add CORS. Okay, and then we need to explicitly allow localhost 9000 as a supported origin that can make calls into this web service that's running on port 5000. So I'm going to just copy and paste the code rather than typing, and I can explain that code. So app.useCourse, and in here we're explicitly saying that please allow any requests that come from this origin, and allow any HTTP header and allow any method. Here you can restrict, and you can say that allow only these HTTP headers, and you can provide a list of HTTP headers. Similarly, you can say that I don't want to allow every method, I only want to allow get and post. You can constrain them, but for this sample I just wanted to allow all headers and all method. And that's all the change that you need to make into this source code to allow the CORS, which is which is cross origin resource sharing. Okay, then now let us see if we can build this and run this. There's one little problem you will see, because when we brought in the Aurelia Webpack skeleton source code, it has the Selenium test source code that still uses the old ASP.NET, which means that it has its own ASPX files, which will not be understood by our ASP.NET Core compiler. So it's going to complain about it. So the first thing we want to do is we'll close this, and what we want to do is we can, okay, I think I made a typo. It should be ASP.NET Core.core. So let me go back to the project JSON and mention that. So So that's the first error. Let me check the version number. Yep, 1.0.0 is supported. Let us try to build it again one more time and see if that reference passes through. Now it's going to complain about the Selenium pages, like I said earlier. So what I want to do is I want to delete those old code which is running using ASP.NET, because we are now using ASP.NET Core, and these ASPX files may not make any sense. So let me go into the Explorer, and then we're going to find those files and delete them. There's going to be two ASPX files. You can read my blog post. It's right there. It's under node modules, node underscore modules, Selenium WebDriver, lib test data. So I'm going to go into that folder and delete those two ASPX files. One is called, I think it's called page.aspx. The other one is called redirect.aspx. Let me delete both of them. There we go, one and then two. Let me delete those two files. And now if you go back and compile, it should work. And it'll launch the browser and load localhost 5000. And we want to make sure that the changes that we made into our API, oops, there's still something left. Tutorial part 4, modern node modules, Selenium WebDriver, libtest page. Oh, instead of deleting the CS file, I deleted the ASPX file. So let me go back into that folder and find the page.aspx.cs file. Yep, let's delete that completely. And now let's run. It's going to launch the browser and show the home index view. Then we will invoke our greetings API and make sure that the JSON is written instead of a string. Okay, it's okay. Now let's type API/greetings, and as you can see, earlier it used to return the string. Now it's returning the serialized JSON with a message property set to this value. Now we are ready to invoke this API from within our Aurelia greeter.ts class. So let's let the debugger running. It's not a problem because that's only a server-side debugger. And I will go into my client-side code, greeter.ts. Okay. And I need to import the required classes that are needed for my application. So first thing is I will need the fetch client, and then I'll also need the dependency injection class, which is the inject class. I'll explain what is that in a second as soon as I get this import going. Okay, so as if you're familiar with the advanced object-oriented concepts, you'll know DI, dependency injection, and also the inversion of control. One of the things about this dependency injection is you will never have to invoke a class using the new and the class name. Instead of that, you let the container, the DI container, know what are all the classes in your system. So if a constructor requires a particular object instance, you will inject that instance using the constructor injection, and the DI container is smart about figuring out the type of the class, and then it creates an instance and passes it on behalf of you. And DI is at the core of Aurelia. Aurelia is already implemented, and that's called an inject decorator. And a decorator syntax is the new ECMAScript 7 feature. Luckily, TypeScript already supports that, and we are going to leverage that experimental feature called decorator, which is available in ECMAScript 7. Okay, now you are familiar with the import statements. I'm not going to repeat it. So the inject decorator is defined in Aurelia framework. The HTTP client class is defined in the Aurelia fetch client. Unfortunately, the Aurelia HTTP client, the simple client, also defines the same class called HTTP client. So if you want to use both of them in the same application, you would use the other syntax as, and then you give it as, fetch or something like that. But since we are not using the Aurelia HTTP client, we're okay with using the default name of HTTP client. Okay, now let's see how I can inject that code into the constructor. So the first thing we want to do is mention that using the @inject decorator. So you'll specify @inject and then the name of the class that you want to inject, or the instance of the class that you want to inject. Okay, so how do I pass this instance into my application? You define an additional property, and let's call it HTTP client, and the type of that is HTTP client. And the difference injection container now looks at this decorator and it knows that, oh, this greeter class depends on HTTP clients. So create an instance of HTTP client and then assign it into this property. And that's dependency injection right there for you. Then what we want to do is you want to configure some parameters on the HTTP client so that we don't have to give them over and over again. So the first thing you want to do is call the config method, and I will copy and paste the code and I'll explain. Okay, so in here, okay, let's look at another interesting method called activate method. In Aurelia, when the view and view model, or when the view model is being processed, you have certain screen lifecycle hooks or methods that will be invoked before the view model gets rendered into the view. So what we could do is there is a method called activate method, and then we're going to use that activate method, which is a hook provided for us. So using that hook, we will configure the HTTP client. So let's go into that. I'll copy paste this activate method, which is a lifecycle event, a screen lifecycle event, which is invoked before the view model gets rendered. So let me fix the URL. Like I told you, instead of specifying the fully qualified URL every time, you could configure it once using the with base URL method, and you're telling the HTTP client that anytime I want to invoke a method call, always prefix them with this base URL so that you don't have to type http://localhost:5000/API for every method call. And use standard configuration. You can always customize the configuration. You can add interceptors and so on. I'm happy with the standard configuration and I'm happy with this base URL. So the next thing that you want to do is, let's close this method, and then we need to call the greetings endpoint. So to do that, I'm going to define a const variable. I'm going to assign this HTTP client into that variable. Then I'm going to call the API by using the await keyword. If you're from C# background, you will know this pattern. Async await is the modern sugar-coated way of implementing promises. So this asynchronous operation it automatically transpiles into a promise, and it makes the promise wait, and then the return value is assigned. The return JSON is assigned into this response variable. So the call that you want to make is http.fetch, and then the method name or the endpoint is called greetings. Like I said, now technically what you're doing is you're making an HTTP call into the base URL http localhost 5000/API/greetings. So that endpoint is defined in our C# ASP.NET Web API, and that's what is going to return that greetings message JSON. So then what I need to do is I need to define a field that can store the value that is returned by that JSON. So I'm going to declare a private variable called greeting message via API, which is of type string. And then I will assign that property, this dot greeting message via API, to the response dot JSON. Actually, now if you do this, this is going to have the complete structure or the complete model. All that we are interested in is really the message property. So what we could do is we could define another temporary variable called var greeting, and then we will look inside of that to get the message property and then assign that into the greeting message via API. So let me go over quickly what we've done. First thing I did was I imported the Inject decorator and the HTTP client from Aurelia Fetch Client and Aurelia Framework. Then I indicated that I want to inject an instance of HTTP client into my greeter class. That instance will be received in the constructor using a variable whose type matches that type exact type. So now we have a property inside of this greeter class called HTTP client that would receive the instance of HTTP client injected. Then we have some screen life cycle events, and one of the event is called activate. This is called before the view model is processed and rendered into the browser. So inside of that, I configured my HTTP client using the standard configuration and the base URL of my API endpoint. Then I invoked the greetings using the modern fetch API and retrieved the JSON into a temporary variable, and then looked at the property of the message property and then assigned that message property into my field. And this is the field that I will render in my view to show you that the HTTP API is being called and the return value is being assigned, and then it goes into the browser using the view.html, which is going to be greeter.html. Okay, so I'm going to add a h2 tag, and I render that new property. There's something called as binding, which you might have heard if you had used the frameworks like, Knockout.js and Angular. Aurelia has binding support as well. It has one-way binding, two-way binding, one-time binding. By default, if you don't specify anything, it's always going to use a two-way binding. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to declare a text box control, and then I will bind that into the same property. So what's going to happen is it is going to look at the view model, and whatever value you have assigned in this view model property is what is going to be shown inside the text box. But when you start making edits to the text box, you'll notice that the view model changes, and because this h2 tag is also bound to the same view model property, the h2 tag will start showing whatever you type, whatever changes you make into that view model property. Okay, now let us save this and go back to the browser because we don't need to hit anything. But one thing is for sure, since we made some changes, it's better to relaunch the server-side API because we have to compile and then make sure that it is picking up the changes. Although I did once, but I just want to make sure, so I'm just recompiling it and launching it one more time and making sure that there are no errors. Yep, so it is fine. And let me go back to the other browser where we already have Aurelia navigation running, and let me dock this into that. Yep. So here's the backend and here's the front end. So on the back end, we just want to make sure that one more time that the greetings API is still running, which is good. Now, I think there is some problem here. Let's hit F12 and see what's going on. Okay, so it's complaining about Bluebird. I know what's going on. We need to make sure that we put the polyfills for Bluebird. Um, let's go and fix this. And we can take a look at the tutorial classes users.ts, and we can reuse some other code from there. So see, there's a polyfill. We need to put the polyfill command. Let's copy this from the tutorial or the skeleton navigation tutorial and put it back into our greeter. So let's make sure that that is being added. Then what we want to do is we want to look at and make sure that the polyfill library is loaded. This should fix those errors. Okay, so it's complaining that the localhost 5000 API greetings is not found. Localhost 5000 API greetings is there. It's up and running. Let's refresh it again. Okay, so let's figure out what's going on. Okay, uh, get 404 not found. Okay, let us go back into the code and look at that HTTP localhost 5000 API, and this is looking good. Let us go into the call and make sure that everything looks correct. I think the call looks good. Here I go. I think I missed a R in the endpoint. Instead of greetings, I put greetings. That is the problem. Now, if you go back and it should refresh, and there we go. We got the original message from the standard property. We got the next message, which is the H2 tag from the return value, which is called greeting message via API from our HTTP API. Like I said, since we have a two-way binding, let's say if you make changes to that, you can see that it instantly reflects in the issue tag, because any change you make is bound back into the view model, and since the view model is already bound into the view, the two-way binding starts working. So you make changes to your view model property through the input text tag, and then that change gets reflected into the view model, which gets again reflected into the view. So you can change this binding to one way or one time and so on. And that concludes this part of our tutorial series. And in the future part, what I would like to do is I'd like to take a to-do MVC application, which is a very popular application that is being maintained by Adios, Manny, and a few other open source contributors. And what they do is they take this to-do MVC application and they just implement it pretty much in every JavaScript framework that's out there. So what I would like to do is I'd like to take this. There's already an implementation of Aurelia, but that implementation is using the beta version of Aurelia. So what I'll do is I'll walk through the steps of how to create the components required to build the to-do MVC application. And if time permits, I'll also show how you can change that style and look and feel using the new semantic UI instead of Bootstrap. Until then, happy coding. See you later in the later tutorial series.